we're on to, this is actually week 11 of a sermon series called The Search for Identity. We're getting fast into some stuff that I wish I knew years ago. I just find myself reading this now with some of this material just going, when I was going through that 12 years ago, where was that passage? Where was that realization? Where was that? And I wonder if that's what Peter's sort of doing as he writes this. Like, I wish I had read this way. I wish I'd understood this before I did that. And anyway, so we call it the search for identity because I think what happens is we spend a whole bunch of time in our lives hoping to find something that will last and something that actually fills the gap maybe that many of us have to some extent in our lives. And that search goes on until you find it, and then you find it in this world and it never actually fills the gap. and I think the timeless invitation that Peter's trying to give us is that in this book is that you can discover a real identity that lasts with purpose and value, but it's at the foot of the cross. And not in a life with the reality of yourselves, but a life filled with the reality of Jesus, filled with his presence, where everything you do is an act of worship unto him. And we're going to get into the topic of work today. But if there was ever a verse, I think that sort of underlines the shift that sort of goes on in Peter's mind about here. Here's where we sort of get to, and this is probably going to, I think, set the vibe for the next couple of weeks. But I guess where I'm trying to get to, there's a verse that really resonates with me for some reason. Verse 21 said, "God called you to do good, even if it means suffering. Just as Christ suffered for you. He is your example and you must follow in his footsteps." There is a timeless invitation that we're going to hit in the coming weeks about some really difficult and hard discussions on a whole bunch of levels, on a whole bunch of very practical issues. And I think they're actually discipleship issues. And I think Tozer actually called them, I think, the crucified life. He said that the crucified life is one radically committed to following Christ. Some might think it's an easy path. It's not an easy path. It is a path where God will take away the problem, where they think God will take away the problems and difficulties, and that we'll live without any distraction or pain. But as anyone who's travelled the journey knows, this is not the case. If your journey is not cluttered by difficulty, hardship or burden, you may well be on the wrong path. That is probably the reality, I think, of what we're about to get into. And I think what Peter is saying in some respect is as the cross of Jesus was thrust into the ground when he was crucified, and Jesus suffered for our sin and for our shame and for our brokenness and for our despair, and he brought redemption and hope and wholeness and healing. Jesus is also staking his claim in the ground for every part of your life. He's not saying you can have this section and I'll have this section and maybe we'll just keep growing this section. He said, no. I want it all. I want every part of it. Relationships. That's a couple of weeks' time. Good luck with that one. Work, finance, family, identity. I want your sense of security. I want your need for control. I want what it is that you give to everything. I want it all. That is the cross-shaped life that Jesus calls us to. So I want to think about today work as not something we do, but as an invitation to the cross-shaped life that Jesus has for all of us. And I'm talking about not just paid work. I'm talking about volunteer, parenting, whatever, all right? Can I ask you whether you've ever given any consideration to the idea that work is actually an important and a God-shaped part of your existence? Yes. I think because I think perhaps I inherited a different sort of story, I think, growing up. And I think many of us did in some respects. My dad moved out as an immigrant at age 3. He was a really hard worker. He got pulled back from primary school, I think, by his family in grade 5 because they needed help on the farm. You couldn't go to school because you got to work. And so I guess on some level, he was a very hard worker, and I love him for it, you know. And he worked hard, and he saw work, I think, in many respects, as a means of income, a means of security for the family, and a means of something better for all of us. And I love that. I do, but that's just not, I guess, all it is. For some, work can feel like a means to an end. Where maybe if I just work hard, I'll get somewhere one day, you know, pay off that mortgage or whatever else. It can also become an obsession, where it's more than just a job. It can actually be like the means to a bunch of must-haves. I've got to have influence. I've got to have success. I've got to have sales. I've got to have this. I've got to have that. And or you can just be so busy doing it that you just don't notice what you're doing. You're just doing it. And I think what Peter is saying is you've got to understand work actually as a key part of a cross-shaped existence with a much larger question attached to it. And the question is, how do I bring something of God's purposes and his creative redemption, let's call it, into my world? This is not a new question. This is something that Christians have been wrestling with for years. In fact, the story goes that in the 1930s and 40s, J.R. Tolkien, who's a famous writer, you've got another guy, C.S. Lewis, you've probably heard of them, who basically both survived the World War I battlefield. They came back. They ended up at a university in London somewhere. They were both remarkable writers and creative people who could give lectures to their heart's content and write books to their heart's content. But instead, they began meeting in this pub on a Thursday night, I think it was, in the centre of London. And the question was openly praying about sharpening each other. And the question they were asking was, how can we bring more of a cross-shaped life and God's grand story of redemption through Christ into our writing? And what happened? How do we capture people's imagination with what we do in such a way that they're actually part of a bigger story than just reading a book? And that was ultimately how Tolkien got to The Hobbit, how Tolkien got to Lord of the Rings, and how C.S. Lewis got to the Chronicles of Narnia. Because they started thinking about how do we bring our work as part of a cross-shaped existence and bring Jesus to the centre of it all. Right, so could I dare ask today, as we consider the question of work, what if God has something similar for us to think about? That maybe rather than just working for the sake of it, maybe rather than just working to simply have an income or pay the mortgage or pay the bills, that rather than just surviving, rather than a means of self-obsession or identity forming, which our world seems really focused on, what if instead, whether as a business owner, employer, employee, parent, volunteer, whatever, was embracing work as an opportunity to model the same sacrificial service that Jesus gave for me? And to provide in part, yes, for ourselves, but more so for others, and to bring something of the creative, redemptive purposes of God into whatever field you might find yourself in. I wish when I was in some of my previous jobs, I had that mindset. And I got to say, I didn't. So, many days. Let's dig a hole deeper for ourselves if that wasn't hard enough, and talk about work as an essential part of our discipleship. There is. Let's just face it. We just read a couple of verses here that we're going to read again in a second, that on a human level make absolutely no comprehensive sense at all. Is everyone okay? We are about to read another passage that you can look at as a modern employee and go, what world does Peter think he is part of? All right? In what world can you embrace suffering, cruelty, and unjust treatment and it works out? Because the passage we just read says this: submit to your masters, do what they tell you, not only if they're kind and reasonable, but also if they're cruel. Who's going to stick around in that workplace? A Christian is. In many places. God is, why? Well, God is pleased when, conscious of his will, you endure pain, you patiently endure unjust treatment. Of course, you get no credit for being patient and beaten for doing wrong. But if you suffer for doing good and endure it patiently, God is pleased with you. Notice that phrase, God is pleased with you, happens about 3 times in that passage. Those verses seem very, very out of touch with reality, don't they? Unless there is a much larger purpose to life and work than surviving and living our best lives, where God is using the ups and downs of our lives to shape us into people he can use. Have you considered for a moment that maybe work is not just work and pain is not just pain? Maybe God is trying to shape people into people he can use in the future. Let's face it, you don't grow up in the hard times. You don't grow up in the easy times. You grow up in the hard times. It's often through the pain, and it's often through the suffering, and it's often through the uncertainty of life, in many less than ideal situations, where you start asking a bigger question. Is God really pleased with my life? Have you ever asked God that question before? God, does my life in every respect today and right now, are you pleased with my life? Anybody just have a realization about some things? I did during the week when I read that. Or wrote it probably more so, and then thought, what did I just write? Consider an example. Let's consider Joseph from the Old Testament, whose probably work situation is a really messed up one, and not what he thought it would be. He was a guy who was sold into slavery by his brothers at a young age. He ends up isolated. He ends up alone in a foreign country, serving the captain of, I think it's Pharaoh's soldiers, I think was the backstory. And he does what's right for the right reasons. He does it for the right reasons. He's wrongly accused, and he's tossed in a prison cell and seemingly forgotten for what seems like a whole bunch of years. And I would suspect he has to wrestle with the daily temptation while he's sitting in that prison cell. I sat in a prison cell for one day, trying to get a confession out of a guy, and that's another story. There was a purpose to that, right? But if you're sitting in a prison cell and going nowhere and doing nothing, and got nowhere to go at all, and it wouldn't have the same stuff that our modern prison cells in many respects would have, there would be a daily temptation just to give up, wouldn't there? Like, why would I be here? He has to sit there quietly, surely with God, going, there is no sense to what you are asking me for. But, just quietly, God knows the nation's about to have a famine, and just quietly, God needs a man he can use. Yeah? And what God doesn't need is a man who's full of himself. God doesn't need a man who's got his own nation-building plans. What God needs is a man who has been formed in the isolation and the pain. He needs a man who has learned sensitivity to God's voice. He needs a man who maybe even can interpret dreams because he stopped down long enough, slowed down and listened to God long enough to do so. And to become the man who one day is going to live in a palace and rescue a nation and feed a nation during a famine, Joseph's got to sit in a prison cell learning complete surrender to God, waiting, trusting, hoping, believing that God is forming him into somebody he can use. And very similar stories for Esther. Very similar stories for Nehemiah, very similar stories for Daniel, and maybe even Jesus to an extent, where the path of surrender and the path of submission to God and the path of suffering through the cross provides the gateway for God's redemption to plan, to come to all of us. And that, my friends, is ultimately the path that God has for each of us today as well. So look, let's just tread a careful line here somewhere in the middle, all right? There are absolutely times in our workplaces where you've got to leave an unhealthy situation. There are absolutely times, having done all you can, that you've got to step away, all right? There are absolutely times where you need to embrace the rights that are available to us today in our modern world that many people probably have not had. And I'm not saying we should in any way put ourselves in danger or in any of that sort of stuff. There are also times I think you just sense that God is moving you to something. You just sense it, and you know it for a whole period before it comes. But let me just say, there are also times where God is inviting us in the uncertainty and often the unjust stuff to surrender our own plans, to see it through, and to be patient in the middle of it. And like my Saviour who gave his all for me, I'm going to take the uncomfortable road, knowing that he is developing me. What he is developing in me is somebody he can use. As I wrestled with this during the week about how do you communicate this, and also how do you necessarily become a person who, in the middle of adversity and the middle of how do you become that sort of person who's living a cross-shaped life? I guess what I've come to is you can't be that person without a prayer life. Because without a prayer life, work is just a means to an existence, if you know what I mean. I was just thinking about Daniel. He's not in the sermon, but I was thinking about Daniel. The guy who gets to the highest echelons of the opposing regime and has to work through it all, but at the same time just goes home every lunch hour to pray. And then he gets in trouble for it, and he gets thrown to the lion's den for it, and all that sort of thing. But it's this centrality of, I will not do this without God. All right? So rather than an optional extra, is there a way we could consider prayer as our most effective workplace tool? I reckon there is. It is for me. The question is it for you? Can I encourage you not to see your workplace as a means of activity, a means of income, a means of identity, a means of, another step on the ladder, but an essential place surrounded by people whose lives can be potentially changed forever through prayer. I have in mind this little verse that I ran into this week from Zechariah 4. Zechariah 4 says, "Do not despise the day of small beginnings." Don't tell me what God cannot do with one person who's got 5 minutes in his lunch hour. To say that, I have a story to share. In 1856, a guy by the name of Jeremiah Lanphier left a well-paying executive job to become a missionary based in a Dutch Reformed church in New York City. He was paid, I think, about $1,000 for the sake of that work, which is, massive, income stuff. He became convinced in that ministry that the only way he was ever going to see God break into the city and to workplaces was to begin to pray with other Christians during their lunch hour. So that's what he decided. So he decided we're going to host a prayer meeting at lunchtime every Wednesday, I think it was. I think the story goes that he handed out, 60,000 flyers to different people in New York. And he basically just said, if 5 minutes is all you've got, awesome. Come pray. Let's come get stuck in. His first day between 12 and 1 o'clock, at 12:30 he's still sitting in a room with nobody else. Don't despise the day of small beginnings. But by the end of the first day he had 6 people. The next week he had 20. The next week he had 40. A couple of weeks later the stock market crashed. And most of the people in the city lost almost everything they had overnight. And you know what happens when you lose everything overnight? You become desperate for God. And desperation for God probably set in to a city that was so self-sufficient it wasn't funny. But they began having to hold daily prayer meetings over the course of the next 6 months. It grew to 20 churches hosting this, and somewhere in the vicinity of 10,000 people would stop to pray during their lunch hour. They had very particular rules about stuff. You couldn't talk politics, you couldn't pray politics, you couldn't pray personal agendas, you couldn't pray for yourself. You couldn't pray, we're not going to hand out food ministries and all that sort of stuff. We're just stuck in with the desire that God's kingdom might come in our workplaces. The conservative estimate over the next several years was that over a movement that started to spread across the eastern United States, about 2 million people came to faith. 2 million people came to know Christ. And it so changed the culture of workplaces that most businesses and factories simply stopped working at midday because everybody in them was going to go and pray. Don't despise the day of small beginnings. And don't tell me what God cannot do with a few no-name Christians that nobody will ever remember who stop and pray for 5 minutes in their lunch hour. I personally benefited greatly from my grandfather, who when I was in a really busy season with my working life, this is probably a couple of years ago now. He's been gone for a number of years now, but he in his 90s just prayed daily for me, for my marriage, for my family, for my work. And I had a purple patch where just life was hard, but like almost everything went my way in some remarkable situations. And looking back, I can't probably put that value into words. I probably can't do that right now. But I think what it also started maybe is part of the reason why I'm here, if you know what I mean. Because what Grandpa started praying probably was part of the journey, if you know what I mean, part of the discipleship for me. And I think there's something in this for us today, just quietly to say, and this is all I'm going to say about it. Our church has always prided itself on being multi-generational, haven't we? And so for the people here this morning who are older, the people here this morning whose maybe the best of their work days have gone, maybe your work just changes, I guess. Maybe for those people today who are out of the workplace and they're sort of missing part of their lives and everything else, I want to say, as you walk around and as you get around and as you meet the people of the next generation who are busy, whose kids are always going places, who have never got enough time to get to church as often as they'd like and all that sort of thing, can I just remind you, you can accomplish so much on their behalf quietly in prayer that blesses the next generation far more than what they understand. Every small group plays a part in praying for the people who are part of them in the workplace. I've even been privileged in recent weeks to hear stories of some of our prayer team have been going out to just quietly out to a farm, go for a ride on the tractor for half an hour, praying for farms, praying for rain. Has anyone noticed how much rain we've had in recent weeks, by the way? Is there any link between the two? You better believe there is, right? You better believe there is. Look, I've probably shared enough, I guess, in the grand scheme of things. But I guess the bigger picture for me was to always to see work as a cross-shaped part of our identity, part of our existence. This is part of the journey of what God is calling His people to undertake. I have a couple of response things that I'd just like to share, and I'm just going to share them with you and just leave the things for where they may. All right? I am convinced that there are many Christians in our world who kind of decided to follow Jesus a long time ago, or maybe have decided to follow Jesus in more recent times, but are not really embracing the crucified life because it's just too hard. It's too demanding. It's too difficult. And life can, without that, just become what I can accomplish, what I can find. It can just become a search for my identity rather than a daily surrendering of my will to God's invitation in my work. And I would simply say this morning that if that is your struggle, you're in good company, and it's okay. But that will be something you want prayer for. I'm aware that talking about work is probably hard to hear when you haven't got work. It just strikes me as there's probably people here today who maybe wish they could work but can't. I've been talking to people during the week who are still looking for work, and the search is not working. If you know what I mean, for whatever reason. I'm sure there's people today in demanding jobs, people who are young, with an avalanche of decisions, looking what would God have for me and for my life? What is He calling me into, and all that sort of thing. And not only are there people here this morning who would happily pray for you, but there's also, I put some prayer cards on each row. There is just simply a pen and a couple of bits of paper on every row, and we have a prayer meeting this afternoon at 5 o'clock. I would just like quietly, confidentially, to take, if you have a particular need in your business or in your work life, I would just like particularly to bring those things to our prayer meeting this afternoon and just spend some time giving them to God. So you don't have to come. You should come, but you don't have to. And it's just simply if you have a need and you can write it down, comfortably write it down, why not put your name on it? Why not put the business where you're working and pray for what you need? And let's see what God will do. there's also, one more thing I want to say. I have a sense some of us have had some really difficult times in our workplaces in the years past. You know, maybe you were retrenched, maybe you were sacked, maybe you were stood aside, maybe you were treated unfairly, maybe there's maybe it's been put behind you but hasn't been forgiven and moved past. And there's a healthy point where you can sit with that and you can let it do its work over time, but there's also a time where you've got to just let it go and just say, this is not going to dictate my future. I was just reading during the week, verse 23 of that passage this morning, in the context of work and in the context of being like Jesus, said, by his wounds you are healed. So if you're carrying a burden on something that has just been passed and you need healing from it, Jesus will meet you today. Why not bring it to him? Bearing all that in mind, I was going to invite the worship team. I just realised we didn't invite Lorraine to pray today. So I'm going to, having said all I've said, I'm going to invite Lorraine to come and pray for us. And then we'll sing, and then, I don't know, I guess we'll go with God. If you can consider one thing, and that's all I'm asking, what would tomorrow in my workplace, what would a cross-shaped existence and a cross-shaped workplace for me look like? Let the imagination run wild, and God leads you where he needs to.